So y'all gonna have to help me out, because I be wanting to know if these places and things that we're seeing, like this, for instance, this is 20 abandoned military projects of the Soviet Union. Are we able to go to these places and see these things up close in person, take pictures, or is it forbidden and you shouldn't be caught around these places? I need to know that, because some of this stuff be actually pretty dope to see, and I be wanting to go see it. You know what I mean? And if I don't want to add it to my list of things I want to see if it's not allowed. So y'all have to let me know that in the comment section. And while y'all doing that, let's check this video out.
The Soviet Union. While they may be gone now in the current decade, their impact is still felt to this day. From the time of World War II until the 1990s, they were one of the dominant superpowers of the world. They were the embodiment of communism, ruled through fear, and aggressive in how they handled their business, which included being aggressive regarding technology and wanting nothing more than to have better weapons, tools, and gear to go up against their rival in the United States and the thorn in their side via NATO. And when you look back at some of the abandoned projects they had going for a while, you'll see how serious they were. Here now are 20 abandoned military projects of the Soviet Union. Number 20. The 1K-17 Jati. Now, some of you may believe that weapons and gear that I'm about to show you are strictly understandable tools that the Soviet Union were trying to make, and not exactly in the realm of science fantasy or science fiction, but you would be wrong. In fact, they were trying to push the boundaries of science many times over, and the 1K-17 Jati is one such example of that. It was meant to be an actual laser tank. But here is the twist. Not only was it a real and actual tank, it was actually operational as a weapon that the Soviets had during the late 1980s and early 1990s. However, before you go off and say, well, they had Russian lasers of death, you need to remember that not all lasers are built the same. Yes, because of science fiction films like Star Wars and Star Trek, we may think of lasers as bolts of energy that are meant to do some serious damage to an enemy ship or the person that they're fired upon, but in the case of this tank, which was also called the compression, the type of laser used was meant to fry electronics from a long distance away. More accurately, it was meant to fry optical equipment and spy technology from about 10 kilometers away. The lasers were arranged in 2 rows of 6 at the front of the turret and were powered by a separate motor at the rear. They used a self-propelling tank body to house the thing because of how big that the lasers had to be in order to do what they were asked to do. So,
now, why I believe all this to be true for back then, make no mistake about it, I think we got that type of stuff that'll destroy you or disintegrate you the moment it touches you. I think we have that type of technology and capabilities these days when we speak about lasers now. Like, don't make no mistake about it, fam. I wouldn't play around with no lasers, probably the stuff we got today.
Why is this an abandoned project of the Soviet Union? Well, simply put, while they were able to make it work and it did have a 10-kilometer range, it was actually hard to manufacture and hard to keep up with, and they were pricey as all get out. While we do have similar laser-based weaponry today, including on naval ships in the United States, we're not going to be carrying any laser weapons anytime soon. Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button, and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Now it's time for the fancy topic. Take a look at this picture. Allegedly, this is the remnant of a massive Soviet jet that they were constructing, and it was eventually abandoned until it was once again rediscovered. Now, obviously, I have some serious doubts about this story, not the least of which is because of the size and shape of this so-called jet. However, to play both sides here, while also making this video long enough to meet demand, there's little doubt that the Soviet Union at least considered making a massive jet at this size at one point. What you have to remember is that during this period of history, both the United States and the USSR were obsessed with jet engine technology. They weren't the ones who made it functional. That was actually the Germans during the Second World War. They had the first jet planes that were used in combat. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union appropriated some of their functional rocket/jet tech and then outfitted it for themselves, and that's why subsequent wars went way ahead from propeller planes into jet engines. But for the Soviet Union, while their jet planes were arguably the best around by some metrics, they would only go so far against a basic principle, that being range. Yes, jet planes have a vast range, but they do have their limits, and that means there are restrictions they would have had to follow if they were going to, say, invade the United States. If they did make a massive one like the one in this picture, they could have a massive fleet of jets, get in much easier range, and then deploy with a whole lot of ease. So why did this alleged project never get finished? It might have been because of the size and the cost, or it could have been because intercontinental ballistic missiles came about and made the need for such a massive craft obsolete. As always, you can comment down below using the hashtag fancy topic and let me know your opinion in relation to what I just showed you on the screen. Number 19. AntiTank Dog. Dog lovers should probably look away right now because it's about to get rather dark and weird all at the same time. Dogs in warfare have a much longer history than you might expect. Whether they were mascots for units, messengers from one group to the next, or in the modern day being sniffers of bombs and other dangerous materials, dogs have been helping soldiers for a long time. No matter the country or belief, they understood that dogs were awesome and they had a whole lot of uses. Enter the Soviet Union, who came up with a most unique way to deploy dogs in the field. Simply put, they would make an anti-tank dog unit with the goal of sending the dogs in to put bombs on tanks so that they could get hurt without injuring soldiers. Now, I'm not really sure that I'm keen on the idea of using dogs as sacrificial lambs just to try and take out a tank, but the Soviet Union was not about having good morals most of the time.
I mean, look at the original. Look at all those dogs, man. Like, if you're a dog lover, like such as myself, like that just hurts your heart to see those dogs knowing that they 9 times out of 10 are not gonna come back. And the amount of them that was just lined up to just go, bro, like that's cruel beyond belief, man. Where were the dog lovers and people to rebel and protest against and stand up against the regime and fight for the rights of the dogs back then? I know y'all like, they barely could fight for themselves. I get it, man. But that just sucks to see that many dogs like that, bro.
The original idea was for the dog to carry the bomb strapped to its body and then reach a specific static target. The dog would then release the bomb by pulling with its teeth a self-releasing belt and then return to the operator. The bomb could then be detonated from either a timer or a remote control, though the latter was too rare and expensive at the time to be used. The problem with this is that dogs are pretty smart, but they do have limits to their abilities and their understanding of certain situations. They could never get the bomb bag off. Another problem is that war is quite loud, and dogs don't really like loud noises most of the time. They would be frightened by the tanks firing at various things or by the sound of their treads, and the dogs were supposed to dive under the tank to plant the bomb but refused to do so. In the end, the project would be abandoned, but not before a whole lot of dogs were killed, including by their own Russian handlers. Like I said, they're not big on morals or doing things right by their dogs. Number 18. Soviet Submarine K-129. From World War I onward, submarines were not only a viable weapon of war, they were a kind of weapon that a lot of nations needed to deploy both to protect their borders and to take down enemy craft that had dared to get too close. To that end, the Russians were all about getting a fleet of subs for themselves once they had obtained new powers and abilities. One of them was the Soviet submarine K-129, which was meant to be a special kind of submarine that would deploy a ballistic missile if the need struck to go at the US or another target. Now, in today's world, some such submarines are all over the place, and both the United States and Russia do have them. But back in the 1960s, when this one was deployed, let's just say that it was a little bit harder to make it work than you would think. Initially, the diesel-electric submarine did fine and had several successful test launches, but on their final run in 1968, it sank. Equally as bad, it didn't only sink, it was lost at sea. The Soviet fleet was then sent out to try and retrieve it, and this got a whole lot of attention out of the United States, who actually did a counter-operation to find it in the 1970s. Even though they did locate the submarine first, they were not able to fully recover it, mainly because it was 5 kilometers below the surface. Multiple other submarines were lost in the 1960s in Russia, showing that their new models did need a little bit of work. Number 17. Duron Space Shuttle. While many don't think of the space race as a military endeavor, you have to consider that both the United States and the USSR knew that if they could get people into space and get satellites into space, they might eventually get weapons into space. Ironically, we don't have that yet, but it might be because that would cause another arms race that we really don't need right now. The Soviet Union was obsessed with space, amongst other things, and wanted to do everything that they could to get their people into the atmosphere, into space, and eventually to the moon. The Buup Space Shuttle was one attempt to do just that.
And the crazy part is this space race still exists to this day. They're still trying to do it. And it scares me to believe what could possibly happen if one party gets there first and is able to establish themselves and do different things and learn things and gain the upper hand on the other one. It's scary to believe where we're headed, what our future would hold in a situation like that. Because we ain't got to name no names, but they wouldn't spare no expense against us.
What made this space shuttle so special wasn't just that it was a space shuttle, it was meant to be a reusable space shuttle. As in one that they could keep using like with modern space shuttles. Buran's launch occurred during a critical time in Soviet history. The country was struggling to recover from the grim legacy of 2 decades of the Brezhnev regime, which had placed international prestige and military expenditures ahead of the comfort of its citizens. And yet, even though it did have a flight, and succeeded in doing what it was supposed to do, they never launched it again, nor did they go and make more of its kind. And you may be asking why. Well, that's because at the time, the Soviet Union was in a bad way financially. And to make more of this craft, especially after the space race had been lost to the United States, that would have really zapped the budget of other programs. Losing a battle like that and seeing your country deteriorate before your eyes, well, that will always have an effect on people, especially those who are at the top. Number 16. The Typhoon Submarine. This next one is just a little bit interesting because it's another case of something being built and being successful, but not exactly being built upon after that success. As previously talked about, submarines were a large part of warfare once they were introduced, and the Soviets wanted some of their own. Eventually, they decided to go for broke and straight up build the largest submarine ever constructed. This was the Typhoon-class submarine. But how big was it? Well, it was large enough to house a crew of about 160 people and be underwater for months without issue. Plus, it had a massive weight displacement ability and was nuclear powered. So, why did they want such a large submarine? Well, that's because it was simply another attempt by them to make a ballistic missile launching craft, and they were quite successful with this one. 6 Typhoon-class submarines would be constructed between the years of 1976 and 1985, which is a decent number, but not exactly a fleet, and that's where the twist comes in. While they were used by Russia for quite a long time, they were eventually phased out. There were attempts to make them more modern, but those came up short for a lot of reasons. These were really costly submarines, and they could make smaller and more effective ones for a whole lot less. Sometimes bigger is not always better. Number 15. The Soviet Lunar Program. I talked lightly before, but let me now dive into the whole hog when it comes to the Soviet Union's attempt to get to the moon. During the 1950s and 1960s, the ultimate goal for both the US and the USSR was to not only get to space with a human, but to get them to the moon as well. Both sides moved heaven and earth, metaphorically speaking, to try and make that happen, and for the United States, they had the Apollo program, and for the Soviets, they had their own Lunar program. In fact, they had several programs under one umbrella that was meant to ensure that the Soviet Union got to the moon first. And for a while, they seemed to be winning. They got the first satellite into space, they put the first human into orbit, and many, many more things. The United States was playing catch-up for much of the space race in the end. However, in the end, the United States got to the moon first, and because of that, the lunar program stalled. Yes, they did eventually do some joint projects together in order to get more Russians into space, which included onto the International Space Station, but to this day, a Russian has never been on the moon. Number 14. Burya. While the Burya itself may have been a failure, it was the start of something very, very, very dark in human history. Because while the space race was going on, the United States and the Soviet Union were also doing an arms race. They wanted to stock up on as many weapons as they possibly could in order to prepare for what they felt would be the true World War III. Atomic and nuclear weapons were one of the biggest things they wanted, but soon the idea of intercontinental ballistic missiles came to be, and the Burya was one of the USSR's first attempts to make that happen. Even with its eventual failure, it started out rather great. It had a range of well over 6,000 kilometers, it could have had a massive payload, and it flew it around Mach 3. So then, what happened to it? Well, simply put, it got beat out by better technology. Soon, better and faster and not easy to shoot down versions of the ICBM concept came into play, and when that happened, the Burya was in fact obsolete. Again though, through its failure came the birth of true ICBMs, and that's a threat that we're still dealing with today. So it's abandoned, but its legacy lives on. Number 13. Project 705 Lyra Submarine. Can you tell that the Soviets were really into making big and powerful submarines? Is that coming off clearly enough? Because if not, I definitely need to do a better job with all of this. But unlike the last submarine I showed you, which was all about size and longevity, the Project 705 Lyra submarine was one of the fastest subs ever built. So, say what you will about the Soviet Union, but they knew how to make missions work for them, even if they did eventually backfire in the end. In this case, the Lyra was not only fast, it was like a bullet, used unique designs and power sources to make it go fast and stay stable, and in fact, they were able to use a much smaller reactor in order to help make it go fast. But that's also where the problem is. Due to its smaller reactor size, the longevity of the craft was dependent on keeping the reactor warm, and as such, these were kept in ports and used more as interceptor craft instead of ones that would lie in wait within the ocean.
So now y'all got me curious. I want to see what they have now. What type of submarines they have now. And what type of technology they have on it. I want to see now, because to see how far they come, and like he said in the video, they have so much love for submarines and building them and making them better and more lightweight and efficient, faster, and being able to stay underwater longer and speed, like all of that type of stuff like that. So I want to definitely see what we have. Not we, but what they have now, or at least the most current one that we could see. Of course, we ain't gonna be able to see what they got now. They're definitely trying to keep that a secret.
And while they were never used in combat, they were used in a kind of false flag operation in order to make the United States and the UK up their game, even though the Soviets had never really intended on making subs of this kind. Number 12. The TKB-022PM. So far I've talked about really big weapons and vehicles that got the Soviet Union's attention and drive, but now let's talk about a more low-key weapon, the assault rifle. In this case, the TKB-022PM, which, as you can see, was meant to be a weapon that every Soviet soldier could use. Yes, there were going to be battles in the water and from far away via missiles, but manned combat is still happening today. and the Soviets had always wanted the best weapons for their soldiers. Ironically, it would be a German designer who had come up with the weapon, and it lived up to many expectations that were placed upon it by the Soviet Union. It could be wielded by a person no matter their dominant hand, and it had great accuracy and more. Although these assault rifles performed well, they were turned down by the Soviet Army for being too radical at the time. Additionally, there were concerns about the displaced center of gravity to the tail end of the weapon and the durability of the weapon's plastic housing during prolonged operations under difficult conditions or storage. Now, sometimes being a good weapon just apparently is not enough.
Yeah, but I can't be mad at him though, because the first thing I looked at was, okay, how would I hold that, and how long can I hold that, sustain that, like comfortability, durability, all of that type of stuff. I was thinking about that. So when he said something, I was like, okay, I ain't the only one sitting here thinking that this thing looks a little odd to kind of hold and maneuver, but.
Number 11. Caspian Sea Monster. The Caspian Sea Monster was a very real plane that the Soviet Union made, not only to be an airplane, but one that could actually ride on the water. The concept is not so weird today, as plenty of designs do that, but the Russians don't do anything small, so when they made this seaplane, they would go really, really big. The craft is the largest and heaviest in the world from 1966 to 1988, and the only reason that the Soviets had abandoned the project was because it literally crashed into the Caspian Sea. Such irony. That all being said, the United States were obsessed with it from afar and spied on it for many years during its testing so that they could learn more about it. It just goes to show how desperate that both sides were in order to top one another. Number 10. The Flying Tank. Tanks are another vehicle that have been used in warfare for quite some time, but they're also one of the more difficult machines to deploy because you have to either float them to the land from a boat or drive them into position for a battle, and they're not exactly fast. That's why the Soviet Union came up with the idea known as the flying tank. They had many attempts to make this work, from just dropping them onto the battlefield to using parachutes to eventually making a glide cradle for them that would allow them to float effortlessly to the ground, detach from the cradle, and then start the battle. As you may have guessed, that didn't really work out because tanks are heavy, and gliding them anywhere is not going to be an easy feat. Surely enough, no such flying tanks exist today. Number 9. Object 279. Are you noticing the secrecy around the naming of certain Soviet items? After all, you can't really tell what kind of object that Object 279 was based solely upon its name. Secrecy was everything back in those times. To pull back the curtain, it was a kind of tank that the Soviets had tested out in the late 1950s, but what was its direct purpose? It would be built with 4 treads, that way the tank would have better traversal ability. After all, tanks are heavy, and if you get them in the wrong terrain, they could well get stuck. This object was meant to be part of a special force of tanks that the Soviets were developing. So then, what went wrong? Well, it was actually nothing bad. It was more of a change in perspective. The USSR were leaning away from heavy tanks in the field and wanted them capped at a weight that the object was well over in the end. Number 8. The Corkscrew Tank. This next tank is actually a classic example of trying to get really creative with a problem and actually making it work, only for no one to really buy into it. As stated before, if you do get a tank in the wrong kind of terrain, it is going to sink or get stuck, which makes it a giant paperweight if you can't get it out. And because most tanks have treads, that's not the easiest thing to fix. Enter the Corkscrew Tank, which was a design that many nations, including the Soviet Union, had tried out because corkscrew-style treads could go through most terrains, making these tanks more amphibious than anything else that was out there. And it really does work. The problem is that it's not really feasible to have a tank like this, and they can be very niche in what they can accomplish, so there aren't a lot that are out there today. Number 7. Flying Saucer. Could the Russians have actually been working with aliens? It would explain a lot of things, but sadly, that's not actually what's going on here. I will admit that the Soviet Union was trying to make a kind of flying saucer during their reign, and it looks almost exactly what you would expect a flying saucer to be based upon pop culture.
Now, I know what y'all are thinking. I'm thinking it too. Could they be behind some of the UFO sightings we're seeing today that we don't know? Possibly. Definitely a possibility. And we've said that. We've made mention to that before, that it could be an enemy plane, device, whatever. It could be them disguising it because they know we're looking out for them. So if they try to use that and blend in, then we won't know what it is and it'll never trace back to them. I get it. I've thought about that and said that several times. So to hear them echo it in the video doesn't do nothing but support some of those theories I have as well.
Known as the Skip, the craft was meant to be a short takeoff and landing vehicle, or Shuttle, and it would be used for special aerial assignments. The design was meant to make it easy to control, easy to keep aloft, and actually be rather cheap to build and maintain. Ironically, it was the cost that would make it doomed, as hyperinflation hit the project after the Soviet Union fell and only the prototype was left standing. Number 6. Zar Bomba. This was an abandoned project of a very specific nature. When the United States had dropped the first atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, the world would be forever changed, and the USSR knew that it had to have its own atomic weapons, so they did just that, and they made the Zar Bomba. And when they tested it out, they almost blew up the world. The yield of the bomb was 50 megatons, making it the biggest atomic bomb to ever be detonated. But the twist here is that it was originally going to be much bigger in its explosive yield. So then what happened? The Soviet scientists grew a conscience and realized that if they did test it with an even bigger explosive output, it could potentially ruin the entire atmosphere and end up destroying the planet. Or it could have just straight up blown the planet up. So yeah, we all almost died. Thankfully, they never made another bomb like that, and thank goodness for their discretion. Number 5. The Battle Mole. Various science fiction movies have shown and highlighted vehicles or weapons that would dig underground to get to their location or target. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union was up for that kind of weaponry and made the Battle Mole. As you likely can predict, it did not work out as planned. Digging through the earth is hard, and you need the right kind of materials and abilities with a vehicle or weapon to make any kind of progress. Plus, once there's actual boring technology, as in the boring drill kind, the idea of making a vehicle like this kind of fizzled out. Now, that's not to say that future vehicles couldn't do something like this, but it would take some effort, and even those massive boring machines take a while to make things like driving tunnels. Number 4. The Tupolev Tu-95 LAL. Now, I'll give the Soviets a break on this one because every nation after World War II was trying to create some kind of experimental plane or another to get an advantage over their rivals, and the Tupolev was easily one of the more unique ideas that they came up with. How so? Well, this was not only a massive airplane, it was one that was going to be powered by a nuclear reactor. Yes, they were planning to fly the plane with a reactor in the back, and even made special steps to try and get that to happen. The obvious problem is that this was risky in all kinds of ways, and so the project would be canceled before it even got the chance to fly. Number 3. Volskaya Island. Just how far are you willing to go to get what you want? The Soviet Union proved their resolve to that question many times over, almost dooming the entire world in the process. And when it comes to this island, that resolve would be no different. It wasn't a place where they stored vehicles or ammunition. Oh no, it was one where they decided they would build and test biological weapons. And I'm sure that went really well. Here's a hint, it did not. Not only did they have numerous accidents there, but they eventually abandoned the island and the lab entirely, and to this day, it lives on in pop culture as a place where dangerous experiments took place, and you can literally fight on this island in the Call of Duty franchise. Number 2. Bakor Cosmodrome. This next one is another slightly complicated one because technically the Cosmodrome was never abandoned. It was commissioned by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and meant to be a place by which all of their space launches would take place, and that is what happened there. However, once they broke up, the location of the base was a source of debate due to how it was in the seized land that the Soviets had taken after the Second World War. After all, the Cosmodrome is in Kazakhstan and not Russia, but it is a perfect place for launching.
All systems are go. Everything is ready for space.
As such, though not officially abandoned despite what happened to the space program, Russia made a deal with Kazakhstan to lease the place until 2050. Number 1. The Akula Submarine. How about one last submarine for the road? The Akula class of submarine was known as Project 941. It was a special class of sub that may have not gotten outright canceled, but didn't have a whole lot of numbers on its side. In fact, a set of them were canceled mid-production, which they wouldn't have done if the sub was everything they needed it to be and more. That all being said, when it was first debuted during the Cold War, the West was shook. Based on their reports, the Soviets were not in a position to make a new submarine, or at least not ready to release one. And so, there it was. It was also one that had impressive stealth capability, including being able to be close to the United States for a month without even being detected. I'm sure that they were totally happy to hear that one. Now that's all from the fallen realm of the Soviet Union and the various projects that they began, so that they could try and be stronger, but never finished for one reason or another. Did it surprise you to see how extensive they were with all of these projects? And which did you find to be the most interesting? Perhaps you know of another Soviet Union military weapon that they were trying to make real.